It's George Bryant part two.
Our dude,
Welcome
we got
back.
it. We got it. I'm all hyped up on caffeine-free Coke Zero. I'm stoked to be back.
Dude, you don't need caffeine, man. Like I am hyped just purely saying your name.
It is true. I do not. That's the thing. The joke is like I'm glad I never got into like hard drugs. Everyone's like we'd be screwed. I'm like, it's all right. I got it. I got it. I got enough energy for days.
Before we get too far down, because I just have a feeling once we start going, we're gone. We're gone. See it.
We're gone.
I want to let the audience know episode 164 was our first conversation. Um, wow. If you missed that one, I don't want to ever tell anybody to stop an episode and go listen to that, but you might want to listen to that episode. That is quite the journey. We're going to elaborate on some of that, and we're going to probably
Mhm.
take some different paths in this episode too. Um, I listened to the vast majority of that episode recently, and one thing I did for that episode was I didn't take any notes. I didn't really have any
Mhm.
questions, something like that. I was like, I'm just gonna
We
ready
just
to roll.
talked.
And you know
Yeah.
what? We're gonna do it again. We're gonna do it again. I have a couple notes here, but I'm not really sure where this is gonna go. And I'm scared and I love it because this is gonna be this is gonna be incredible. Um, there's a lot of things we didn't cover. And
Mhm.
I know as soon as like we hit the stop recording button, we just talked for a little bit afterwards. We're like, yeah,
We
we gotta do
did.
this again. We gotta get you
Yeah.
back. And here we are.
Yeah.
We're back. Oh, this is
Yeah, and,
awesome.
and and in true transparency, like I'm honored to be here, but my body's already pre-sweating because you ask good questions and make me feel safe. And I'm reminded often in the power of my story, but also it's to anybody listening, it's also a muscle and it's one of those things I hide behind and not sharing it as much. And I forget, that there's so much, wisdom and potential lessons for people in it. But it's definitely a muscle to share it. So I actually enjoy it. It's like my gym. And I'm like, all right, let's get uncomfy. Let's do this. Like,
Yeah,
let's
that's
grow. Let's
amazing.
go. Yeah.
Well, for the people that never listened to that episode, they're just gonna let this episode go. Quite the journey. Wow, just you were very vulnerable and honest. With some really deep things that have happened in your lifetime. I'm not just talking about one, two, or three things. There's more than a handful of things that would just shake anybody to their core. And you pause and you hit on each one of them. You let me ask questions about them. You answer them honestly. Like that takes a really big person. So I really appreciate that. Hate to say it, but I'm expecting the same again.
Yeah.
So
Well, I've dedicated my life to living that way. And I even truthfully on my podcast yesterday, I've been stretching myself and I shared my testimony yesterday,
mhm.
with God. And I realized that most of my life, the reason that I struggled, like things happen to everybody, right? And everybody's view or the lens they see the world comes through their own experience. But, most of my life was living in reaction or a victim of that story because I was afraid to pick up the pen and just own it, right? Like the joke I tell people now, I'm like, I just speak as if I've already been canceled, but that has nothing to do with everybody else. It's just radical ownership
Yeah.
of myself and like this is who I am and I love myself to pieces and I'm grateful for every single one of those moments like at a level I can't even articulate.
Uh, I'm not sure if you've listened to my episode with Lauren Sizzler. Are you familiar with Lauren Sizzler?
No, I'm not.
I need to connect you to because
Okay.
I interviewed her shortly after you, and she went through life. I think at about 19 years old, both of her parents died of opioid addiction within 5 hours of each other. She just lost everything within 5 hours, complete shock and surprise. And it took her like a decade to start like owning her story. And so now her mission is to help others own their story. And you just said own your story. So it's like
Yeah.
I have to make that connection with you both.
I would
That's
love
just
I
like
would love
that's a
it.
match made in heaven.
I would
Absolutely.
love it. Yeah, I mean, like I joke with people because like my life is relegated to like fortune cookie reminders that my simple marine brain can remember, right? But it's like the way that I summarize it is like I was living in a self-created prison because I was too addicted to reading my own story rather than picking up a pen and writing a new page.
Mm,
And that's where faith comes in and the faith in anything too. I even wrote this the other day and I was like all of us try to architect this life of comfort but then it eliminates the need for faith and growth. And that's where like I really like look back and it's like the things that I have in my life now, the things that I value, the things that I would like die to protect only came through those moments. Like my values as a father, right? Like my
Yeah.
values as a partner in a relationship, my values of friendship. Like even when you and I connected, I was like, bro, I feel so safe and connected with you. But like those values come through the stories that we live. And
Mm,
it's like, yeah, the gym hurts, but I also like the man that I am on the other side. And it's like,
mhm.
I forget those. And like, I joke with people too that I'm like, because I like to like coach myself on these things, but I'm like, you forget that when you ask God to move mountains, you wake up with a shovel, right? There isn't like this,
I love that.
here it is. It's like, oh, here's the path to become that. And I even wrote the other day too, I'm like, all too often, I find myself praying for things that I don't have the character or scars to maintain.
Mm,
And like that's where experience comes in. And I'm like, but it's those experiences, like as a parent, we get this, right? Like our view changes based on the adversities that we face, which change our perspective and how to handle them in the future. And I'm like, isn't that the whole point of life? Like it's
yeah.
just to create stories and experiences. And I think that that was a part that I think was the hidden blessing in my life and all the parts of it, right? Like the things that I value now, the time, the touch, the way that I raise my son. Like my son is my best friend, right? Like, and even right now, navigating a divorce and realizing that there's a time in the not so distant future I'm not going to live with him anymore. And I'm like, and it helps me recognize like what I value. I value time, like I value memories, like I value creating those connection points. And I wouldn't have that if I had it as a child. And so I think it's all perspective. And it also like too, I think it's before we even dive in even in what I shared in the first episode, like also like I don't ever want anybody to feel bad for me because it's all relative. Like I look at my life and I look at my story and I'm like, amazing. Like, don't wish that it went away. But I have a friend, and I don't know if I share this, but like I have a friend who grew up in the exact opposite. Like he lived in a like 22,000 square foot house as a kid.
Yeah.
And the thing that always breaks me with him, he was texting me earlier, is always breaks me. He's like, my childhood was hiding to see how long it took for somebody to find me. And it was like 7 or 8 days. And I'm like, whoa, like I would have died.
It's like
Like
Home Alone.
I can't even imagine that, right? And so I think it's all perspective and it's all our unique path, right? And I think that the more gratitude we have for it, and the more we say thank you for it, the more perspective we get and the better we can do with it.
Okay, we're going to touch on that momentarily. I actually have thankfulness and gratitude written down. Part of the reason because it's almost Thanksgiving. It's time
Yeah,
to be thankful and grateful. And you know what? It's only fair. I request my guests be honest and vulnerable, so it's only fair that I am. So you said something that connected to me that I had zero intention of bringing up, but hey, this is life.
that's how it works.
You said you were very like comfortable in your own story, in
Hmm.
the life that you were living. You basically kind of were like self-reflecting and moving on and starting running to new chapters. I want to talk about that. I have someone in my life that's very close to me. I'll just go ahead and name it. My mom, who
Hmm.
is very much like that. 5 years ago, one of the reasons I started this podcast 4.5 years ago. The pursuit of happiness. One of the main reasons I started this podcast was because I was caught, am. I'm actually, it's a current day thing in the middle of a divorce, my mom and my dad. And I would say my dad's done a pretty solid job for the most part, keeping me kind of like out of it. But my mom does a great job of just bringing me in the middle of it, which I absolutely despise and I hate. So it's one of the reasons I started this podcast. I just felt like I was in a really terrible place, a lot of shame, a lot of guilt, being in the middle of divorce, unhappiness, depression. And I said, I need to talk to people that are happier than me, people that have a path forward in life and can show me gratitude and thankfulness and all this stuff. But I literally had this conversation with someone, I forget who it was the other day. And I said, I'm still dealing with a mother who just refuses to see the bright side of things, refuses to be thankful or grateful for anything that she has. Obviously she has a new grandchild that she loves to FaceTime with, but that's kind of as far as it goes right now. there's a lack of positivity. It's very woe is me, very self-pity, very victim mentality, and it's extremely hard to deal with. And it's worse around the holidays. And now that I have a grandson, it's like I feel like I have to get my grandson involved. You can't just like cut off ties and move on. At least that's how I feel. And I said in this conversation, I feel like she doesn't want a reason to be happy. Um, and you're shaking your head, yes. And I'm like, that's not something I can relate to because I don't understand that.
Hmm.
Do you? Because you just said you are very comfortable living your story. And I think my mom is just, she's constantly, woe is me. I'm all alone now. This isn't the way my life was supposed to be. Every time I try to cheer her up, it goes right back to yeah, it shouldn't be this way and stuff like that. And it's just like, my God. And maybe you can even give me some advice afterwards of like how to
Hmm.
handle a situation like that because it's just like I can't comprehend it. I don't compute it, but it sounds like you can relate to that. So help me here and help anybody who knows anybody like that.
Bro, I was your mom. I was your mom, like at the deepest level. And the truth is that nobody could get me out of it because I wasn't aware or had a catalytic moment that inspired me to get out of it. So the rest of it was just people's advice, their love, their guidance falling on deaf ears because everybody enabled me to be in it. I never
Yep.
had to face the discomfort of me genuinely seeing what I was creating in my life. I had a pastor say this a week ago. I wrote it down. That's why I just opened my phone. When you have a funeral of your expectations, God replaces them with grace. But what I was surrounded with was people's expectations of what they wanted my journey to look like
Yeah. That's
instead of
dangerous.
allowing me and loving me in my journey, which has boundaries, which has, communication built into it. But it was the people in my life who loved me for where I was, but also said, I'm not going to tolerate this. Right. And it was this line of like, I love you, but in order for me to love you, you're going to have to put a little effort into loving yourself. And they would keep hard lines with me. And it was raw and it was honest and it was real,
What
but
kind
it
of
was,
lines are we talking about? Is that just a flat out vocal? I've had that conversation. So it's like,
yeah.
what levers can I pull here?
Yeah, and I'll just speak for what landed for me. It's
Yeah.
not the conversations, it's the boundaries and behaviors. Like I'll think of actually I'll share an instance, and this is with people in my life that I won't name, like out of respect, but family members where when I had my family, we would make rules and we're like, hey, we're going to come over for Thanksgiving, but here's our one request. We don't talk about anybody that's not at the table and we keep it positive. And we're like, and if we don't, then we're going to remove ourselves. And I remember this one Thanksgiving, and it was on Thanksgiving. How timely, since it's in
Mm.
2 days when we're recording this. We drove an hour and a half to go up, went there to have dinner. We literally put our plates down in front of us and it started. And without speaking, we looked at each other, we packed our bags, we threw our son in the car and we went home. And it was the end. And it was like, nope, cool. Like I love you, but I don't love you enough to become a product or a character or a cast member in your story. And it wasn't one time. They came to visit in Montana a couple of years ago, and we were here for celebrating. We went out to dinner. We're sitting at dinner. We sit down at the table. We eat. We're about done eating. It happens again, and we're like, "We'll see you guys at home." And we just get up from the table and we left.
You're doing, yeah, okay. That's the things that I have not put my foot down that hard. Wow.
And those were the moments with me that landed the most. Like my ex-wife did this to me, and I'm so grateful for it. But there were moments where it's like, hey, this isn't okay. And it was like I'd come home and I'd be in that mood, and she's like, you need to go get a hotel. And I'm like, got it. And like I would go and I would accept it willingly. And like it's those moments. But I had many, many friends like that. And they're like, my love for you is loving the best version of you, not tolerating or accepting this version of you. And there's an invitation there. And it's different for every single person because every situation is unique and nobody can teach you how to love or teach you, how to hold that line. But I genuinely see people, and I'm blessed that the people that were in my life loved me enough to be honest with me, but they weren't just honest with words. They were
Yeah.
fully aligned. It was their words, their behaviors, and their boundaries matched. And it's like we would never, ever, ever, look at our kids and be like, "Hey, by the way, this is the rule because this keeps you safe," and then let them break it over and over and over again. But when it comes to like the emotional capacity and resiliency, we can't want it for somebody else more than they want it for themselves. But we can hold a line, and we can hold a line with love and grace, right? Like I'm a man of faith, right? I pray for my enemies. Like I pray for them when it happens. Like I turn the other cheek. I don't turn the cheek and look away. Instead of responding to anger with anger, I respond with love and grace, but it also has boundaries in it. I'm like, hey, like, I love for you to be a part of my life, but like, I don't talk about people like this. So, like, if that's going to continue, you can't be a part of it unless we can change the conversation. And like, those have been the moments that have defined me the most. And I've been blessed to have some incredible people that were willing to hold that line, right? Because everybody communicates differently. But that was the biggest breakthrough that I had was when nobody engaged in my story, I was forced to sit in it alone.
Mm.
And once I got sick and tired of sitting in it alone, I was like, maybe I might want to try this on for size. Like I might want to shift my perspective. Like I might want to talk to somebody. I might want to pursue this gratitude practice or changing my habits and behaviors. And truthfully, the only thing that ever shifted for me is like I'm a pretty stubborn dude. Like I'll own that all day. And it took me losing everything numerous times for it to hurt bad enough for me to actually want to change it. But when there was no cost associated with it, there was no reason for me to change. I could just
Yeah.
change how I told the story. I could change my behavior for a week or two. And I'm like, oh, look, I'm back in. And I was blessed to have some people around me. They're like, I love you, but I love you, not your story, not who you are, not all of this. Like, I love you. And they held a line with me really, really hard. And it was communicated, but it was also very clearly communicated with boundaries. And that's what shifted my life so drastically because I had never been forced to sit in my own story. I would have somebody else hit my needs, or I'd tell you this sob story. Like, even when I share my story on your podcast, like, I think I remember saying this at the beginning, like, I'm not telling this story for you to feel bad for me. Like, I'm
Right.
not telling this story for you to, like, even empathize with me because there's a part of me in my life where my story was my defense mechanism. I would use vulnerability as a spot to control and manipulate people. Because if I tell you how bad it is, you feel bad for me instead of me telling you or sharing with you who I really was in that moment or how I felt in that moment. It became a tool that I could utilize to, and I didn't know this at the time. I know it now. I was manipulating people
Yep.
over and over and over again. I'm
Yep.
like, oh, if they feel bad for me, they'll hire me. If they feel bad for me, they'll help me. But none of it was from my heart. It was all this version of me that I wanted everybody to know. And I became addicted to being the wounded version. And so now that's why, like, very rarely do I tell my story, or if I tell it in context of like, and by the way, I get it.
Yeah.
And it doesn't have to stay that way. But it was very loving people. Like I had psychologists fire me. And like, we're not doing this anymore. Like you can Matt Damon me all day, but eventually you got to look in the mirror and you gotta take a different action. And it was like a seeming one of these people. And it actually reminds me of one of my best friends, Stefano Safondos, because he's the one who shifted it the most. We talked about this about 3 months ago. We did a fishing trip down the river in Montana, fly fishing for 2 days. And this moment had happened 5 years prior. And I was like, can I ask you about something? And I'll never forget this. It was December. I was in Mammoth. And my marriage was already on the rocks. Like we should have never been married, but I was in denial. And I remember calling him and I called to him and I was bawling. I was yelling at him. It was like 45 minutes of like purging, like hyperventilating. Like it was so bad. It was like 7 degrees Fahrenheit outside in a snowstorm. And I was walking the streets barefoot in shorts and a t-shirt for 45 minutes. Like it was
Mm.
that level of intensity. And he listened to me for 45 minutes. And I was in victim, I was in wound, I was like, my life is over, blah, 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 blah. But I was also advocating my responsibility the entire time, right? It was like I'm a victim in all of this. And he had known me long enough. And he lets me go for 45 minutes. And then I get to a point where I'm like complete, right? I'm like out of energy. And I'll never forget this. I was like, what do I do? And he said, sit with it longer, mother effer, and hung up on me. and he didn't return a
Wow.
call or a text message for months. He just straight up walled me, like straight up walled me. And it was one of the most profound and powerful moments of my life. Like he's my best friend. I cry, but we've shared all of this. And it broke me to the core because he didn't let me run to somebody else to cope or to do it. And that moment genuinely changed my life. And we were just together. We were talking about life and catching up. I was like, hey man, I never asked you, like, can we talk about that night for a minute? He's like, oh yeah. And like we've joked about it and we've co-facilitated and we talk all the time, but we never like talked about that moment. And he's like, that was one of the hardest nights of my life. And I was like, why? And he's like, I had to make peace that when I said that, there might be a chance I never talk to you again because you
Yeah.
were so fragile. Like I had to know and be okay with the fact that if you decided to take your life, like it wasn't my responsibility, but what was
Oof.
said had to be said. And he loved me enough to be honest with me. And he cried to me when we were hiking. We went on like a 20-mile hike one morning. We just went for a morning walk. And then 20 miles later, we're still
20 miles
walking.
later.
And we're talking about all of this and we're bawling together because I was like, I didn't recognize that you had that level of awareness and knew where I was. And he's like, but I also knew that if I didn't say that, there was zero chance that it would have changed. And it genuinely saved my life, like
Mm.
saved my life at a deep level. But he was willing out of love to be honest with me at the deepest level. And it took a couple years for it to shift. But that moment was a like catalytic moment for me because that was the thing I'd been avoiding. I had been avoiding feeling my whole life. Every time I told the story or woe is me or all of it, there was a reason, a justification, a why. And what I was really doing was advocating my ability to feel because I never wanted to feel it all. And that's what that moment did for me. And so I don't know if that helps, but like
Oh,
that's
this is connecting big time. It's I feel like that story is like 5 steps down the road from me, but it's like I'm heading in that direction because it's like I've had enough. But like my fear is that my mom is older, more set in her ways, more stuck in her ways. I don't know if she has the desire to find happiness. She'll ever have the desire to find happiness. And then before I know it, I'm going to lose my mom. And it's going to be like the last 10, 15, 20 years of my life. Like I never really got a great conversation with my mom. I never got to get close to her. I never got, her grandson never really got to see the good parts of her because she's just so stuck in her depressive world. And it's just,
well
I'm fearful.
in the spirit of vulnerability, I'll share two personal stories about this. Number one is my father. When my father got diagnosed with metastatic brain and lung cancer, the Marine Corps put me on a humanitarian transfer to take care of him for 6 months. And I wanted my father to live more than my father wanted to live.
Yeah.
And it
Yeah.
came to this moment where he looked at me and he's like, I don't want this. Like, I just want to be done. And it broke me. It broke me because I was like, I just want you here. Like, like, why? And what I wasn't doing is I wasn't respecting his own journey and his wishes because I had desires and wants and needs that weren't taking that into account. And we had what I would consider a come to Jesus moment because about 3 weeks before he died, after caring for him for 6 months, we got into the biggest fight we've ever had in our life, like worse than my childhood, like screaming, yelling, breaking stuff, like 12 straight hours of just like war. And we both ended up so exhausted that because he had had his leg amputated from ischemia from a lack of blood flow and he had his tumor and he was paralyzed and we fought and we were sitting in his bed and we both passed out from exhaustion and while we were sleeping we cuddled each other and we woke up the next morning like holding each other and there was just this like unspoken acceptance that both of us saw it differently but like there was this respect of like I see your model of the world and you see mine and it hurts but like I can't change it. And like that's where we had peace. And then that fast forward to I didn't talk to my mother for 15 years. 15 years. Because when I was a kid, I think it was like 15, 16, and the divorce was ugly, social services, the lawyers, the drugs, the arrests, all of it. I was like, I want nothing to do with this. My mother had accused me of stealing and all this stuff. And both my parents were sick. And so I was like, I'm not talking to my mom at all. And I think it was around 15 years that I didn't talk to my mom until I went to a personal development conference. And the first thing they ask you is like, what's your life like? What are your parents like? And then they assign stretch goals. And they made a rule with me that I wasn't allowed to come back into the room on this course I paid for until I called my mom. And so after like 15 years at like 2 a.m., I called my mom and I was like, hey, I'm calling you for this, and boom, boom, boom. And it brought my mother back into my life, but in a very kind of boundary-esque way, and started a healing process. And then fast forward to about a year ago, my mother and I text now, and she sends me things in the mail. I'm looking at a book that she mailed me, and it was about a year ago. She was calling me and she's like, hey, I need your number. I need to add you in my healthcare proxy. I need to do blank. And I called her and I said, we need to talk. And I was like, I don't have the capacity nor the desire to be that for you. Like, I love you. Like, you're my mother. You brought me into this world. I've forgiven you. I have peace and healing. And I've struggled to communicate and talk to my mom because, like, my memory of my childhood is very different than hers. And who knows what the reason is. And that's her history in life that I don't feel called to share. But it was tough for a while, but I'll never forget this phone call because I held a line. And it was like the first time I ever got to talk to my mother because she literally was like, I hear you. And I'm so proud of you for putting your family first and being a husband and being a father and standing in what's right, because this is really all about your family. And there was like this deep level of healing and respect when I like kind of put my foot down, and I told my mother, I'm like, you're probably never going to meet my son in person.
Wow.
You can send him cards, like I tell him about you, and like I've prayed about this for a long time. And she's like, I understand and I respect that. And there was this peace in me that I've never had before. Now I text my mom, she comments on my Facebook, she does all these things, but it's also a level of love and respect while also focusing on my family and like my son and his desires and his health and like what supports him. And so like I've walked through this like numerous times.
You might end up being a guiding light for me through this entire process, whether it's another month, another year, 2 years, 5 years, 10 years. I don't know, but I'll keep having you on and we can keep chatting about it. Um, yeah, it's a really, really tricky situation. Um, like I said, the fear is damaging that relationship so bad it doesn't come back. And I also like I've seen from this whole divorce thing, whereas like if she's really hurt, she's gonna fire back with like spite, and it's like very unbecoming. I hate seeing that. I don't want to be part of that, and I feel like if I take any of these steps, it's gonna be coming back at me, and it's like energy. It's kind of like you just said. I don't have the energy for this. I have
Mhm.
so many things to worry about and be concerned about. And I've used this metaphor before, and I talk to my wife about this constantly. Is like if you look around and how much I have, yes, but also how much I've worked on myself, and especially mentally. I have everything in the world to be happy about, and my life is trending in the right direction. It's because like I've lined it up to go in this trajectory. I've done everything I possibly could. I continue to do everything I possibly can. But yet I feel like I'm running with a freaking parachute behind me. And it's just like keeps getting like pulled back. Like, nope, you can't be that happy. Let's get on, come on back. Your life can't be that good without me. Come on back. It keep pulling me back. And it's like, why can't I just live a freaking happy life and the people around me just be happy for me and support me and lift me up? And I just feel like I keep getting pulled down. It's the worst.
Man, I resonate with this, but then what I had to look at is that I was the one that was keeping the anchors tied to the parachute because of guilt,
Yep.
because I felt like I had done something or I hadn't done enough. And truthfully, what I refused to do was grow. And so there was this version of me of like, even in navigating the divorce that I'm going through right now, I've gotten in trouble a lot with my friends and people that love me because they're like, dude, you self-sacrifice everything. And then I got called out and they're like, it's like you kept score and you think that because of things you did years ago, you have to just forever be X or forever be Y and do X. And they're like, that's not how forgiveness works.
Mm.
Like, you have to make the right decision for you and for your son and for what's next. And you can't because you're like operating in this like bank of I owe this or I do this or I have to do this.
Yeah, this is very familiar. Yeah.
And it took me, I mean, like, you want full transparency. It took me till 3 days ago, 3 days ago in that bucket to do it. And I realized that I was living in fear because I live with my ex-wife because I'm afraid of not living with my son.
Mm.
And I got that fear instilled in me at his exact age right now when my parents started getting divorced and everything fell to pieces. And I didn't realize how much of that I was still driven by and reacting to and all of it. And then there was a big awakening in me this last weekend where I was like, holy moly. And it like hit me like a ton of bricks over and over and over again because I've done it in every other bucket, but that one, that is the one that's closest to my heart. Like, that's my best friend,
Yeah,
my
that's
little
tough.
8-year-old.
Yeah, man.
And then I have this clarity and I have a conversation and it feels like 1,000 pounds are lifted off of me. And then truthfully, without him even knowing, like being around it, we get in the car and he's like, Dad, when are you going to get your own house? Like, I'm just like excited to have somewhere else to go. Like, we'll do. And I'm like, what? Ah! Right? Like, almost like God has a sense of humor. And
Yeah,
he's like, I've
yeah.
been waiting. Like, I've been waiting. And then the moment the action is taken,
Wow.
opportunities appear.
Wow.
And it resonates deeply with me because there's been profound moments on the other side of every one of those, what feel like choosing myself and my future, not because I don't love and I don't empathize and I don't feel bad, but when I'm in that guilt bucket, I'm not supporting either party because I'm reacting to something from the past and I'm not building something for the future. So not only am I not handling the thing that I'm tied to in the parachute, I'm not changing anything in front of me to be able to handle it in a different way that I can't see yet because I'm stuck in the rumination trap.
This is speaking volumes.
And I think it's a never ending finish line because also to think like you and I both have kids, you have one way younger than me,
Yeah.
but then realizing like in 10 years, he's not going to live with me anyways.
Hmm.
And then there's going to be another version of me and another thing that comes up. And my daughter and her boyfriend, like who live with us, like, what happens if they break up? What's that going to require of me? Or where do I hold that line? Because he's like a son for me. And like, what would that look like? Like, there's this constant evolution of our growth, but it requires that we be willing. And this is what I said earlier, to have a funeral of our expectations, but also a funeral of our past, because you can't write a new book when you're still reading the old one. And a lot of the times it's that fear of the unknown. But I realized, and personally, like anecdotally, the reason my life kept repeating the same patterns is because I wasn't writing a new page. I was reacting to all the old ones and expecting a new
Hmm.
book to be written. Like,
Yeah.
I didn't write a conclusion because I'm like, I don't know what comes next. I don't know what it's going to look like. And I'm like, but that's the beauty of all of it. You didn't know what this podcast was going to look like.
No.
But yet at some point you're like, oh, screw it. Right. Let's do it. Right.
I'm throwing
Have it.
myself in the middle of it.
And it just feels like this consistent journey of choosing the best version of ourselves and recognizing that that version also has a different perspective and tools to bring the other ones into integrity. But I found that if you're the one who sees it, you have the responsibility to shift it because
Yeah.
the other person's unaware. And that's really what it boils down to for me over and over and over again. And I've never been punished for making the right decision from my heart.
Mm,
Does it fix
I love
itself
that.
instantly? No, not at all. Typically, it gets worse before it gets better
Yeah, I get that.
because when the truth is created, you're on a solid ground, not hollow ground. And then there's a grieving process and everybody throws it out. But then when all the dust settles, you're like, okay, cool. Now what?
Yeah.
Now that it's all out, what are we going to do?
Yeah.
Like,
I
who
d-
do we want to
I,
be?
I love that. I'm Really curious. So when was this Thanksgiving where you just packed up and left? How many
Was
years ago was that?
truthfully, it was 5 years ago. And then a month later, we moved to Montana to create space.
Oh wow. Okay.
Like, yeah,
So my question to you is maybe you didn't need to explain this to your son. But if you did need to explain this to your son, why the hell you just packed up and left in the middle of a Thanksgiving dinner? I, as a dad, now I'm genuinely curious. What the hell would I tell my kid? Because it's like, how honest are you with your son? Do you want to be like, hey, here, this is what happened, or is it like, let me just keep this between myself and like, and keep him out of it? Like, what is your thought process on that? How did that go down? And if he was older, if you had to explain it to him, how would you handle that?
well, it still happens, and everybody's parenting style is unique. The way that I've approached this is I speak to my son like he's an adult, and I realize that there's evil and darkness in the world. And if he is not aware of it, he won't know how to navigate it if he's sheltered from it all.
Yeah.
And so for me, this actually happens quite frequently. And I talk to him about it. And we work really hard on understanding that our joy is our job, that our emotions are our responsibility, that we can't allow the outside world to darken or harden our heart. But that also means that we can love people and we can love them with boundaries and expectations. And so he's been educated on this a ton over and over and over and over and over. And every opportunity is an opportunity to speak to him about it. And he's 8 now. And
Was he
so
upset? Was he upset when you had to leave Thanksgiving? Did he really know what Thanksgiving was at that
he didn't
time?
know what
Or
Thanksgiving was then, but there's been a couple of moments since then where he was aware
yeah,
and he'll have his emotion and we'll ask him like, how are you feeling? And he's like, oh, I'm feeling this. And I'm like, and what story are you telling yourself? Well, this and this and this. And I was like, well, there's multiple stories. I was like, there's also this, and this creates the opportunity for more. And it's always this like education and empowerment moment. But I very, very much speak to him like he's a peer of mine, just in his language around personal responsibility, around accountability, because he has things at school. He's like, and I've seen this happen where he's like, hey, dad, like somebody was really, really mean to me at school today, and like this and this and this. And he's like, every part of me wanted to yell at them and name call back. But then I realized that they were involving me in their story. And that isn't how I really felt. And he's like, I was like, so what'd you do? He's like, I told the teacher. And then I asked them for it to be different. And I told them that I wasn't going to name call back. And I'm like, this is when he's 6 years old.
wow,
Right. And so it's this thing like I get this all the time. I get canceled on the internet the other day. I found it the other day. Somebody in town was like, oh, I've heard of that dude. He's a wife beater. I've never put my hands on anybody. Nobody. Some slander, some anything. And the way that I see all of that is that no matter what, the darkness, the evil, the things in the world are going to show up. But I can choose love in every moment. But love is not, I'm going to be self-sacrificial. I'm going to be a martyr. Love is like, I love myself enough to be honest with you. And this is what love looks like. And I also love you. But like we would never let somebody come into our home, walk into our kitchen, throw all the dishes out onto the floor and break them and be like, oh, I can't wait to have you back for dinner. Right. But we let people do it to our emotions. Like, who's going to stand up for our emotions? Like, who's going to protect us in that moment? Like, that's us. And that's the part that, like, I've worked on so wholeheartedly. Like, I love people enough to be honest with them. And I want people in my life to love me enough to be honest with me. And, like, my friend circle, you'd swear it was a therapy couch every day. Like, even my best friend TJ was over here recording a podcast earlier. We recorded the podcast and we spent an hour calling each other out. You said this and you said this. And like, what about that? I see you doing that. And I'm like, all right. Then we cry together. We laugh together. I'm like, dude, I love you. Thank you for sharpening my iron. Like, thank you for holding me accountable. Thank you for loving me enough to be honest. Right. And like, I think that that's part of the lesson in life is like, my job about my son is not to teach him who to be or to make a mini version of me. It's to create an environment where he feels safe to identify who he is and how he wants to show up in the world and to be educated about how the world operates for him to be able to make his own decisions. And that's how I see it. And so I'm very open with him about everything.
well, from my perspective, and as a new dad, and like I feel like you're setting your son up for success, and I'm excited to see the man he's going to become because of everything you're teaching him. I think that's freaking incredible, and it's admirable too. So
Yeah, and it's
congratulations
hard.
on that. Yeah, I'm
It
sure it
is
is.
hard. Like I'll have conversations, he'll ask me questions and I'm like, God, every part of me wants to give some parent response of like, oh, we'll deal with that later. I'm like, but he has an innate curiosity. Like his paradigm's formed. He's 8, right? It's already formed. Like he's
Yeah.
picked up habits, behaviors, beliefs, socioeconomic, school, teachers, me. I've already installed plenty of trauma in him accidentally that we're gonna have to work out in personal development later when he gets older, right? Like all of this is here, but then like my heart hurts because like all I want to do is like protect my son. And I'm like, oh, boom, boom, boom. But like truthfully, protection is like perspective and resiliency. It's the ability to know what happens around you and then have the self-agency to know what decisions you make and how you navigate that and how you operate that. Doesn't mean I don't bawl myself to sleep at night. It doesn't mean when he's like, hey, dad, like, I really wish you and mom would still live together. And I talked to him about it, educated. I put him to bed and I don't bawl my eyes out, like bawling, bawling because like I feel it. But then at the same time, I'm like, that's mine to feel. And the situation is the situation. And part of life is finding joy and meaning and gratitude and all the things that show up for us to be able to create them. And I can't allow my fears to be instilled into my son and then him have a tainted view of the world. Like
Yeah.
it's hard. It's even like when, kids fall and get hurt. Like this one's been a big one for me since day one. Like every part of me when my son has gotten hurt wants to pick him up and coddle him and do all of that, but it conditions a response, right? I don't care where you are in the camp on this, but then now it's funny because my son will get hurt. Like we went ice skating the other day and he smashed his knee, smashed it like hard. And I'm like, oh, bro, I know that hurts. And he's like, Dad, I'm like, yeah. He's like, it hurts. And I know you can't make it feel better, but like it hurts. I'm like, I got you, bro. I'll carry you off the ice. Like, we have these moments, right? And then he sits down on the bench and he's like, hey, dad, I don't want to skate anymore, but I know that's not the solution. Can we just skate for 10 more minutes and then leave so I don't quit when I get hurt, but I go back out there? I'm like, let's go skate, bro. And we did, 3 laps and I was like, we can go now. And like, I remember that moment when he was a kid. He was like 4 years old, went over the handlebars on his bike. He scraped the skin off his nose, his cheek, like, I mean, road rash. And I had this intuitive moment as a parent. I'm like, if I don't put him back on his bike, he's never going to ride a bike again. And so he's in the bath, like we're nursing his wounds and he's like petrified. And I was like, hey, bud, we got one thing to do before we sit down and play. And he's like, what? I'm like, we need to go ride that bike down that hill again. And he's like, why? I'm like, because the bike also always has the ability to hurt us. The roads always have the ability to hurt us, but we can't let it get us off the field. And we went back, put a helmet on, and he rode that bike down the hill. And it's just been these moments over and over and over. But like I look at my story, and it's because when I almost lost my legs, and the doctor was like, we're going to amputate your legs. And I was like, no, the hell you're not. I had one physical therapist, like, this isn't going to be easy, but like, you get to keep your legs, but you're going to have to fight for these. Like I wouldn't have legs if I believed that story, right? Like so I think that there's a part of this of like really empowering and educating. And like we have anecdotes across the world of people that like, oh, they told me I never walk again. Well, if you believe that story, then that story's true. I'm like, but if you believe you can, that story can also be true. And at least you put the effort into trying. And like that's how I want to raise my son.
Okay. There's like 10 different avenues. I do want to touch on that story, but I have a question written here that I think kind of relates to what we're talking about. I think this relates to you personally, how you've grown over the years and how you also communicate with your son. And it's the topic of negative self-talk.
Mm-hmm.
Um, what has been your growth with negative self-talk over these years? And do you openly like communicate this to your son? Do you see your son saying stuff and you kind of like halt it? Because this is something that's really important to me and it's important to this household. Within these walls, I'm trying to just have a home that's full of positivity. We don't say that here. We do not bring the negativity. We don't self-doubt ourselves. Can't isn't a word. That's the kind of the home I want
I
to
love
really
this.
support that. So I want you to
I
kind of hit
do
on that.
not I do not believe in toxic positivity, which is pretending it's not there. That is, I think, the biggest mistake that people make because it bypasses the story underneath it. So yeah, my journey, probably the the most atrophied muscle in my life and the one that I've had to work out the most is how I talk about myself, like at a
Yeah.
very, very, very deep level. The one thing I don't do is make myself wrong when I talk about myself in a negative fashion, but I hold myself accountable and I
Can
unpack
you
what's
explain that?
underneath
What
it.
does that
Yeah,
mean?
1,000%. So we actually had a podcast about this earlier, my buddy TJ. We were talking about the conscious and unconscious mind, right? And I'll have rumination, I'll have imposter syndrome, I'll have self-doubt, and I'll catch myself in my brain being like, oh my God, I'm not good enough. Well, I don't like say cancel right away. I ask myself some questions, right? One of my favorite questions is, when did you decide that? When did you decide that? Like, when did I decide that I wasn't good enough? Like, when did I decide that I'm stupid? Like, when did I decide blank? I don't ever ask myself why, because why creates an unlimited rumination gap. I ask myself, when did I decide that? Because it's an empowering decision, because at some point I installed that belief, I installed that thought. There's a piece of evidence around, or a story that happened, or a client that happened, or a friendship that fell out where I made up this story that created this belief in me, right? And I think, to my point on toxic positivity, is like, you can't just put a band-aid on what's causing it and treat the symptom. Like, you got to get to the root of it so you can rewrite the disease that's underneath it, right? And so one of my favorite questions is like, when did you decide that? Another one I ask myself is like, I'll be like, oh, I'm like, well, what are you pretending not to know? And I talk to myself a lot, right? And what
Hmm.
I'm trying to find is when that story was installed, because at some degree that story served me to get to this point. It might have been a survival mechanism. It might have been a coping strategy. It might have been something that I utilized to make it out of a situation, but it's no longer serving me if I catch it, right? So I'm like, at what degree was this serving me? Like, what was the benefit that I was getting? I'm like, oh, yeah, I decided that I was a horrible father when this moment happened. And I'm like, well, great. How did that benefit me? Well, it allowed me to cope with this and this and this. I'm like, well, is it still benefiting me? Yeah, no, it's not. And instead of just bypassing it, I acknowledge its existence, not with shame or fault or blame or guilt, but like genuinely understanding that, like, my unconscious mind, right? Like, there was a study done on this in the 70s, but the number irrelevant, but they figured out that the unconscious mind processes somewhere between like 10 and 11 million bits of information per second, right? But it filters it to the conscious mind, and the conscious mind only can retain about 167 of them per second. The filtering process is based on our stories, our experiences, our life lessons, and all of it. So my buddy TJ explains this. He's like, it's like having a dump truck full of toothpicks and then grabbing a handful, and that's what your conscious mind processes.
Mm.
But your unconscious still filters it through all the stories and the evidence and the things that have happened in your life. But if we don't ever talk to it or get to the bottom of it, we don't ever rewrite that to see the world differently. We just keep picking up those same toothpicks and expecting something different, like we're going to muscle our way through this. And so I believe in positive framing. I believe in a positive mindset. I believe in positive affirmations, but I don't believe in them as a way of like bypassing what caused it in the first place, which is what allows you to rewrite it so that it goes away, because that is how your reticular activating system works.
Hmm.
But in order for your unconscious mind to notice things differently, you can't just consciously think about it. You have to install it in your unconscious by finding what's causing it in the first place. Like, where'd that story come from? How did this show up? How did that happen? Now, to the point of my son, I talk a lot about this, right? And there's some profound and powerful moments in this as well, because we were driving in the car 3 weeks ago, and we were driving in the car and I was responding to a client of mine. I'd like helping them with some customer journey stuff. And I forgot something. I just forgot to send something. And so we're driving and I'm like, hey, so and so, like, super, super sorry. Like, I'm such an idiot. And my son interrupted me in this audio, and I left it in and sent it. And he said, Dad, you can't say that about yourself. That's not true. You just made a mistake and you
Oh, I
forgot
fucking
something.
love that.
My 7-year-old, like, body checks me, right? In the rest of the audio, I'm like bawling. I'm like, hey, I'm so sorry, Susan. Like, here it is. Like, boom, boom, boom. My son just took me to church real quick. Like, let's go, right? But my thoughts aren't wrong, right? Like, if you really, really think about our thoughts, right? It's not only the stories that we've experienced, but the thing that I say, it's the stories that we're taught and caught, right? The music we listen to, the shows that we watch. Like, there's a reason I don't watch horror shows. There's a reason I don't watch crime documentaries. I know about the evil of the world. There's a reason I don't listen to music with negative lyrics is because my unconscious mind is processing all of that and changing this view and filter. And I end up with this tainted version of myself. And so I believe in positive reframing and positive speaking, but I also believe in having radical responsibility in it and understanding where it comes from. And if it shows up, dissecting it and getting down to the bedrock of it so that I can rewrite it permanently and have it not be a part of my ecosystem, because I don't like repeating the habits and behaviors and the that show up. And so when I have them and when he has them, I'll ask him things like that. Like he'll say things like, "Oh, Dad, like I just can't do it." And yes, I'm being really honest with everybody. I ask my 8-year-old, I'm like, "Well, when did you decide that you couldn't do that?"
I love that.
And he'll look at me and be like, "Well, in this moment." I'm like, "Well, yeah, but is this the first time you've had that thought?" And he's like, "Well, no." "Well, this happened at school." I'm like, "Okay." And I was like, "Were you feeling off?" And he's like, "I was." And I was like, "How did this make you feel?" And he's like, "Oh, it made me feel a little bit better, but I still didn't feel good." I'm like, "Okay, what would have made you feel better?" And he's like, "Well, if this or this or this." And I was like, "Well, that sounds like a good thought." He's like, "Actually, yeah." And it's just being inquisitive and being there, but not making them wrong. Because I think the mistake, like I'll own this all day. Like as much as I have answers, I get to take this medicine more than all of you, because I also am dealing with confirmation bias because I can teach it and I can talk about it, which advocates my responsibility to live it sometimes, and I hide in coaching it.
Hmm.
And so it's like this really, really simple thing of like gratitude practices are huge. Gratitude and anxiety can't exist at the same time. Gratitude shifts your reticular activating system to notice more of it. But if you're checking the box of gratitude and you're not feeling the gratitude, it's not making any permanent change. And so I found that getting to the root of it and not making it wrong that it comes up, but using it as like an exploratory moment, like think of it like surgery of like, oh, it's interesting this one's still coming up. Because I still have stories that come up all the time, but I have stories that I used to tell myself that I can't even fathom saying anymore. Like I'm like, I can't believe I used to say that. Like I'm embarrassed for some of my old podcasts. I'm like, oh my God. Right. But there's this like flexibility and exploratory phase in it to where it's like all of it is like telltale signs of your body's relationship with itself, right? Like our conscious mind is logically processing, right? It's the front of our brain, but our unconscious mind is what stores it all. And really, it's the connection between the two. And I'm like, well, if I'm having those thoughts consistently, they're rooted somewhere deep in my emotions, somewhere deep in my body, somewhere deep in my story. And I was like, let's go searching. Like, let's go find these things, right? This could be meditation, could be breath work, could be journaling, could be free writing. Like, one of my favorite things to do is when I start having them, and I've done this with him before too. I'm pointing to his bed. That's why I keep pointing. I'm like, that's where his bed is. I'm like, oh, over there, him. Um, I've found that what I'm really trying to do is process, but I don't allow myself to because I make the thought wrong. And so if I'm alone in this, what I'll do is I'll be like, because we're friends and I have your number, and I would do this with you because you'd hold me accountable. But I'll be like, God, I'm like such a bad father, right? I'm like, okay, you want to be right? I set a timer and I let myself be right for a minute, but I don't do it with myself. I open up my phone and I record an audio to you. I'm like, hey, Ryan, I just need a minute. I'm going to tell you every reason I'm right about why I'm a bad father. And I don't ever make it more than 10 to 15 seconds before I delete that damn thing because I can't handle hearing it anymore because I know it's not true. It's some defense mechanism or something I'm just processing and it like shifts instantly. Right. And I used to do this on the internet. I used to go live and do it on social media
Wow. That is
because
accountability right there. Holy
I,
shit.
I wanted it eradicated bad. Like, I'm like, no, 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 this isn't serving me. But what I found is that I was making it wrong instead of making it right. And the moment I make it, I start processing it. And all of a sudden, it doesn't stick around anymore. My perspective shifts instantly, instantly. And I do this with my clients too. I make rules with them because they'll say things like, oh, I'm a bad entrepreneur. Like, I can't get past this. So I say, cool. You can be right as much as you want. I was like, but here's the rule. Make this rule. They're like, yeah. I'm like, the moment you have those thoughts again, you have to open your phone, record a video, and pre-commit to sending it to your wife before you record it, and then you record it and send it. Just the fear alone of having to do that and face that, also helps me and them recognize that it's not true. It's just a story. And the story doesn't have to be real, but you can still process it and you can still acknowledge it. And it helps you reframe to positivity like really fast. Like that's what I do.
That's amazing. I love that. Okay, that's huge. That's a huge nugget I'm gonna take into my life. And I'm curious about this. I've gotten to the point now where I'm 42. I could not have said this 5, 10 years ago. I'm 42 now. I feel pretty confident that I can handle most situations thrown my way. And I say
Facts.
that with pride. I say that because
Facts.
I've worked on it myself. If it's like, there's a goal I want to accomplish and it just seems astronomical, it's kind of like you said, give me that shovel. I'll start
Yep.
digging. Let's go. Well, tell
Yep.
me where to start. I there's a sense of pride that comes over me. It's like, you don't think I can do this? Watch me. Um, I love that. I love that about myself, and I think I can conquer most anything. I think that's a great example. But not everyone, I'll say, like in my circle or circle of friends, family, or whoever it is, feels that way. Most people don't, honestly. Most people don't. I'm sure you know that. How do you handle that juxtaposition, if you will, knowing that you can move mountains, but people around you feel like they can't even like start with the trail? Like how do you have this conversation? Because you can't always just be like, let's go, come with me, we're gonna do this, because they just don't necessarily feel like it or believe that they can. So how do you have those conversations?
It's a great question. Well, you nailed it too, right? So like the four stages of competency, right? So there's unconsciously incompetent, which means you're unaware, right? Then there's consciously incompetent, which means you're aware. Then there's consciously competent, which means you're actively learning or growing. And then there's unconscious competence, which means you've mastered something, right? And there's the
Yeah.
four stages that like every human being goes through with anything, right? I didn't know. Now I know. Now I'm working on it. Now it's a part of my identity, right?
Mm.
I think number one is the way that I would answer this is that every mountaintop that's summited is summited alone. We think people are summiting the mountain, except they're climbing a peak next to us. They're not on the same one. And every journey is an individual journey. It just feels like they're with us, but they're not on the same path. They are a ridge line over,
Wow.
and we're walking consecutively. That's number one. Number two, I think it's the gift of vision because of life experience, stories, situations, trials, and tribulations that our perspectives grow and shift. I believe there's a responsibility in those perspectives to hold and see what we see, but not make anybody else wrong for not seeing it. That's the invitation for leadership. I coined a term for this in coaching a long time ago. I don't talk about this often, but I call it the burden of leadership. The way that I define that is the ability to see somebody's next 30 steps, knowing if I give them more than one, I'm disempowering both of us
Mm.
because I'm not really leading. I'm trying to force it down their throat, but I'm also creating codependency and not allowing them to follow their journey. And so I think about this with my son, right? I think about it in so many ways that I can see. I'm like, God, if he just did this, if he just did this, but he doesn't have those awarenesses yet. They're not in his purview yet. And I was like, oh, but if I can see that first bite and I can embody and model that first bite, all of a sudden he starts to do it. Like you'll get this as a parent. They don't listen to a damn word we say, but they watch everything that we do.
Yep. Yep.
And they end up as carbon copies of our behaviors. And I think my definition of leadership is not having the answers verbally, it's having the results behaviorally. And that's where the game is won. And you think about people like how many, and random example, but how many people told Elon Musk he was crazy, but they didn't believe him because of what he said. He showed them sleeping on the floor, XYZ, over and over and over. And then they start to pick up evidence along the way and they become aware of these things and they start to do it. So having the conversation is also having very clear expectations and understandings that most of the things that we want to accomplish, I believe most people aren't going to understand or see because it's our vision. It's not theirs. And so it's also communicating in a way that doesn't harm anybody else, but also inspires them to potentially support or take that action. And we might be 12-mile markers ahead of them, but that doesn't mean they can't run the race. They might just not be able to commit to the ultra marathon yet. But once they get to mile one or mile two, they might start to see it a little bit different. And that's what change starts to look like. Like it requires a vision, requires somebody to see something that nobody else sees in our own life, with our habits, our behaviors, our relationship. And one of those parties being able to hold that, regardless of the other person's journey and what it looks like, with patience and love, until they can become a part of it or start to see it as well. And I think that that's like the easiest way to unpack that. And I think about that as an entrepreneur. Like that's the one that makes the most sense and the easiest sense for me. It's like even when I lost that 100 pounds permanently, like 2 years ago, people got so used to me being fat and 260 pounds. I was like, oh yeah, I'm going to go back to being a competitive athlete. Like, yeah, right. You've been saying that for years. And I realized that I was just talking and I wasn't doing anything. So I shut up and I got to work, and nobody saw me for like months. I wasn't on social. My team was running social. It was just podcast clips. It wasn't really here. And I'll never forget, I did an event. Everybody showed up to the event. They're like, where the heck did you disappear to? And where did half your body go? And I was like, oh, I realized that like I was too busy telling everybody about this vision and telling everybody about this story instead of putting the reps in to be the example. And it led a lot of people around me to like take their health seriously and realize that even at 40, you can have a six pack and you can take care of your health and you're never too far away. But it wasn't my words. It wasn't my ability to paint the picture of what the vision looked like. It was my actions that gave people evidence to be like, I want to be a part of that, or I can do that for myself. And like, that's how I see it when it comes to like changing anything in life. Like, even if as a parent, I know back when we were married, I'd be like, I was unhappy with how some things were happening. So I'm like, hey, we need to change this. We need to change this. We need to change this. A lot of lip service and no action. And I'm like, nothing changed. The moment I drove on my own part, not with my partner, just with me as a parent, I'm like, okay, well, I'm going to install this. I'm going to install this. I'm going to install this. Within a matter of weeks, all parties involved were doing the same thing. And I was like, ah, okay, I'm picking up what you're putting down, but it's no different than parenting a child. And it's being the embodied example. Like, I can't expect my son to do something that I don't do. Like, so when I wake up in the morning, our beds are in the same room. The first thing he sees me do every morning is pray and then make my bed. And I've never asked him to make his bed ever. I really don't care, truthfully. Like, I'm not a big component of like, if your bed's a mess, your life's a mess. Like, I don't care, right? Like, I've never made my bed until the last year. Even in the military, I resisted it like it was the plague. I'm like, screw you, like, whatever. But like now in the morning, like we'll get up, and I went downstairs the other day and I started making breakfast, and I came up, I'm like, what are you doing? He's like, oh, Dad, I was making both of our beds. And I'm like, got it. Got it. Right. And so it's this embodied example. And I think all too often I can only speak for myself, fell into the trap of thinking that if I communicated my vision, it was going to bring itself to life, instead of me just taking action to build it and allowing people to see the process and then ask to be a part of it. So that's how I would answer that.
This is really resonating. So in September, I started this coaching journey with Marcus Philly, who I hired as my coach. So I had
Love
Marcus and I,
Marcus.
you know, Marcus?
I don't know him personally. I love his content. I love his
It's great.
story. Like the dude's just an incredible man from everything I can pick up.
So I had him on in August, and he resonated with me a lot. And I said afterwards, I was like, dude, I think I want to hire you as a coach, because what you're saying is like I'm picking up what you're putting down. And so I started working with him Labor Day, and so we're about 2.5 months into this. Well, almost 3 months now. Let's just say, yeah, the results are definitely there. But I think like one of the most things that I'm proud of is now like having a son. It's like, yeah, my time is taken. So it's like, when am I gonna make this a priority for me? The only answer was like 6:30 a.m.,
Mm-hmm.
6 a.m., 6:30 a.m., something like that. And it was just like, fuck. Like I wanted to sleep until like 8. And then I did my workouts at like 6:30 when it was too late. I had to get home from the gym at like 8:30. And I'm like, well, if I do that, I'm never gonna see him because he's gonna be going to bed. And then I was like, I can't, I gotta be there. So it's like, so after like a week of doing this, it was like, you know what? I want this. to be the thing my son sees, that when he
Hmm.
wakes up in the morning, dad already got after it at the gym. Dad's making progress. He got up before me and he worked out hard. He started the day with something really positive and he pushed himself already before I even woke up.
Hmm.
And like I'm motivated now. Now it's
Hmm.
like, fuck yeah. Like he granted he's 8 months, but I'm pretending that in my mind he's 8 years and he's
Yeah.
watching me.
Yeah.
That's how I feel.
It's the best. It's the best. And to God, to even to what I shared earlier, Marcus is a 100% spot on representation of everything I just shared.
Yeah.
If Marcus never spoke and just showed people his results in his life, you'd be like, what is this dude doing? Right? Like, I want to be a part of this. Like, I'm in, I follow it. Like, I consume most of his content, most of it. And like, I know fitness, I know health, I know nutrition. And I'm like, no, no, like, this guy is the tip of the spear. Like, it's not words. His words are basically explaining what he lives and embodies every single day. And my son is the same for me, man. Like, even before we moved into this house, like every morning, my son would wake up out of bed because him and I are like roommates and we would co-sleep. But every morning he'd get out of bed, he'd wake up at 6:30 and he'd come see me. And I was on the treadmill with the red lights on, listening to scripture
Mm,
every single morning. And then now it's the same way, but like we'll wake up and he'll get up and I'm up and he's like, Dad, did you pray already? Dad, did you do the red light? Dad, did you? I'm like, yeah, I did. He's like, you want to do it? He's like, yeah, let's do it. Right. There's this level of accountability as being a parent, but I also look at business the same way. Like I feel the same way about my customers, right? Like how can I coach you or teach you on something that I'm not doing behind the scenes? Like this is
yeah.
why I thank the Marine Corps, right? Like the Marine Corps' definition of integrity is how do you show up when no one's watching and no one will know? And that's really like
That's
what,
that's what the definition of character is, right? Is what you
yep.
do when no one's watching.
Yeah. And like that's where I'm in those thoughts, when I'm in those stories, when I have those limiting beliefs. And I'm like, well, great, I can believe these or I can write different ones, right? Motivation is fleeting. It doesn't exist. It comes on the other side of action. And half the time we do things, we're not like, oh, like I'll tell you right now, like when I get up early and I go get steps in Montana, it's like a cold. I'm not like, oh, I'm so excited to do this. I'm like, no, I want to be in my warm little bed.
Right.
Like I want to be curled up in a ball hitting snooze like 75 times. And I was like, but my why is greater than all of that. And is it
Yeah.
perfect? No. But then in the process, there's that moment, you know, that moment, right? Where you're like, oh, you're like cold, your body's cold. You're like, why I'm doing this. And then you find like that animal switch and you get in and you're like, I'm so glad I did this. Right. And then it's like fuel for your fire. And you're like, all right, let's keep going. Right. Like motivation comes on the other side of action. Like the positive self-talk comes on the other side of an action instead of believing that negative self-talk, right? Like everything is on the other side of action. You can go read the book Chop Wood, Carry Water. You can go read the book The Comfort Crisis by Michael Easter. You can read the Bible if you want to go that route. Like everything comes in the lens of intentional action, regardless of what your brain is saying. And this is why I love C.S. Lewis too, because the book Outwit, no, the Screw Tape Letters by C.S. Lewis. I read that book and it changed my meaning of the devil is in the details.
Mm,
Because the way that I took that away is that the devil is my head and God is my heart. And anytime I'm thinking I'm not taking action, and it's way easier to hit a still target than a moving one. And so I can think how I think and feel how I feel. I just force myself to do it in action of where I want to go because it's way harder to hit me and it's way harder for me to believe the stories if I'm in intentional action about where I want to go. I've also realized that that's what rewrites the story very, very aggressively because I'm in action of creating evidence that dispels the stories that I'm telling myself or even the feelings that I'm telling myself. Oh, I'm too tired. I look at my Garmin. I'm like, I slept 8.5 hours. Like, what are you
yeah.
talking about, bro?
Yeah.
Right.
Yeah.
And so like it's really interesting because I've just created these little like almost like mental get out of jail free cards for me. Or like I'll be sitting on the couch and like, God, I should have been doing this. I should have been doing this. I'm like, you're not doing anything right now. I have a Beckford push-up bar on the floor. And when I find myself in it, I literally get down on the floor. I'm like, well, do 20 push-ups and think about this. Let's see how
Yeah.
this feels. Right.
Yeah.
And then it just starts rewriting it over and over and over. And like, that's why I love the book, The Comfort Crisis, because Michael breaks this down. It's like before we had social media, before we had the internet, before we had constant heat or Uber Eats to get our food, you didn't have the ability to sit on your couch and ruminate about how hard your day was, or else your family was going to freeze because you didn't have a fire. So you could think what you think and felt what you felt. What's the one thing you had to do? You had to take physical action. And it just so happened that's what eliminates the thought,
Mm.
right? I think about this often because we're also the only mammal that doesn't have a built-in biological function to drain trauma. Like you see an antelope almost get eaten by a lion. It's the first thing it does. It shakes and it goes back to eating grass like it never happened because it's releasing it. The human body is movement. It's
Yeah.
actually like movement, right? Rebounding, moving, sweating, doing all those things. But inaction is like the biggest stagnation trap that happens because every moment you don't take action, even the things you're ruminating on, you're just giving yourself more evidence to mentally masturbate. But if you just take an action, even if it's like, I'm going to go pick up that trash, I'm going to go put one piece of clothing away. I'm going to go write down one thing I want to do. I'm going to go walk laps around the house. I'm going to do 10 push ups. It is impossible to stay stuck in that rumination trap when you take that action. And so, like, I think about that all the time. And my son is the same way for me. I'm like, I know he's watching. Like, I know he's watching. I know he's thinking. And he'll call me out, bro. He'll call me out. Speaking of him, are you getting your iPad? Okay. He just walked in.
Amazing.
He'll call me out all day on it, right? And he'll be like, "Hey, Dad, you slept in this morning." I was like, uh-huh. I did. I did. He's like, "Dad, I heard your alarm go off like 30 minutes ago. What happened?" And I'm like, "Well, buddy, I hit snooze today." And he's like,
Accountability
"Okay."
partner, whether you want it or not.
And I'm like, "And thanks for acknowledging it." It's like, "Yeah." I'm like, "Yeah. And you know what? You're right. I'm going to do this and this and this. And thank you." Right. And it's not about perfection. It's about progress. And I
Yeah.
was like, you catching me on this is huge. Right. But like all those things matter so much. And I think like even in a lot of what we've talked about, the one antidote for every single thing that I've ever struggled with is basically taking an intentional action aligned with who I want to be in the future instead of believing the thoughts I have now, the stories I have now, or the results that I'm living in right now.
Mm.
And it's not having a perfect plan, it's taking imperfect action in an opposite direction that I'm currently stuck in. That could be a hard conversation. It could be one text message. It could be going to do a walk. It could be, hey, the fork didn't make me fat. Maybe skip that dessert, right? Like it's just these little things to where my heart knows, but I'm like wrestling against my mind and my flesh. And it's like ignoring those desires and be like, you know what, I can do this, right? Like I'm gonna go do this one thing. And then when you do it, it's contagious. And you're like, that was a way better choice for me. Like my future self's gonna thank me for this, right? Like
Right.
I think about that with my fitness, right? Like I have a goal. Everyone's like, what's your goal? I'm like, I want to be doing backflips when I'm 80 for my grandkids. And they're like, yeah. I'm like, that keeps me moving. That keeps me moving. But like if I don't get on the field, I don't have the ability to grow. I don't have the ability to learn. And I'm really just staying stuck where I am and expecting a different result. And I did a post on this like 4 years ago, but it popped up today. And I wrote, what you're not changing, you're choosing.
Makes complete sense.
And it's all too often this trap of like, oh, I'm going to swing for the home run. I'm going to swing for the grand slam. I'm like, how about you just swing,
Yeah.
right? Like just swing over and over and over again. Like you can, what about Bob this since we're the same age? Like just baby steps. Right? We can
Yeah.
just boom, Bill Murray baby steps into this thing, right? But it's like boom, 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 boom. And there's so much power in that. It's like, I'm not going to allow my story to define me. I'm not going to allow X to define me. I'm not going to allow this feeling to define me. I'm not going to stay stagnant and stuck. I might not know where I want to go, but I know I want to go somewhere, and somewhere
Mm.
requires me do something different than I'm doing now. And it's like, write a new page, write a new moment. Even in 12-step programs that I've been through, they're like, sometimes you do it minute by minute. Like, what do you do? Well, you have gratitude for where you are, because if you're aware that you're not happy, you're at the starting line.
Mm.
Have gratitude that you got here, but then what's one thing you're going to do? It might be one prayer at a time, one phone call, one hard conversation, one small step. But it's like we're the architects of our life. And every moment, rather laying a brick, for our future vision, or we're letting time pass by and missing an opportunity to make it as big as it deserves to be. Because the bricks don't lay themselves.
Freaking awesome, man. You reminded me a little bit, just going back like a minute or two, about like just showing up when you don't really want to. And it just reminds me, a couple years ago, I had a VO2 max episode, and I was like, I want to know what VO2 max is. You hear a lot about longevity, lifespan. I like to push myself in different directions and try to physically try things I've never thought of trying before. So I had a coach on from VO2 max. What the hell is VO2 max? At the end of it, she's like, I'll give you a workout. We'll test your VO2 max, and then I want to see what your VO2 max is at the end of it. I was like, fuck, I'm in. All right, let's do it. I have no idea what I was signing up for. That sucked. That sucked big time. But there was something about enjoying the suck. And there was something about it became almost addictive showing up when like no one else was. And it
Mm-hmm.
was like, fuck yeah. Like I remember I did it all summer and I blew away my stats at the end of the summer. And so much so that I ran a race and I got first place in Raleigh for my age group. I blew everybody away. I was like, I'm not even a runner. I just stuck to the program, pushed myself when I didn't feel like it. And I was like,
Mm-hmm.
now that the race is run, I don't want to stop. I let's go. And so like I'll never forget December and January came around. I'm still fucking running this VO2 max. It is 15 degrees outside. And I'm telling my wife, I'll be back going to the track. And it'd be 7:30 at night, sleeting on me.
Yep.
And I'm like, if some other motherfucker's at this track, I'm gonna be pissed because I want to be the only one here. And it was like, as much as I did not want to get in that car, and I knew it was cold as shit.
Mm-hmm.
When I got at that track and I stepped foot, I was like, let's fucking go. No one else is here. Show up, do it.
Mm-hmm.
And man, there's power in that. Like I just, as much as you don't want to do things, is when you start doing that, you start gaining power. And it's just an incredible feeling. It's just
Well,
something you said reminded me of that because it was
well,
like,
it's I'll give you the science on it. Huberman did an entire episode of this called the mid-angulate singular cortex of the brain.
is that what
They did
Goggins
this
pushes? Like, is that what he goes like crazy
in one
about?
in one way. Yeah, yeah, yeah. That's what Goggins pushes. But here's the thing: Huberman and them did an entire study on this, right? It's the basically the part of the brain, and I'm not a scientist, but I'm breaking it down George style, that is associated with willpower and the will to live,
Mm.
right? And it's a muscle, like it's an actual muscle of the brain. And here's the craziest part of it. The only way it gets stronger is if you do things you actually do not want to do.
Yeah.
And the size of it increases the more you do that. And that is what they figured out where human willpower and desire to live comes from. It's called the mid-angulate cortex. And to your point, it's only like this is why I hate ice baths, but I also love them. I
I
hate
get
the
it.
process. I hate being in the water. I hate being cold. I hate the tears that I have. I hate all of it. The only thing I love is the feeling on the other side. And I love that I genuinely hate them because I resist them like the plague, no matter how
Mhm.
often I do them. But I also know that every single time I do them, I'm getting stronger and I have more desire and capacity to live. And I was even talking to my partner about this, about the Marine Corps, because she's like, what was it like? And I'm like reflecting on boot camp. You know, this was 20 years ago, over 20 years ago. Holy moly, 22 years ago. I feel old now, Ryan. Um, over 22 years ago. And I was like, there was this moment at boot camp, right? Where it's like, she's like, what is the first couple days like? I'm like, oh, they don't let you sleep for 96 hours. Okay, I'm on a podcast. Can we handle this in a little while? I know, but I'm on a podcast, bro. But do you want to come say hi? Come say hi. Say hi, Ryan.
Hi, Ryan.
This is
How are
that
you?
little one.
How are you
Good.
doing?
Good.
You ready for Thanksgiving?
Yeah.
All right, me
Mhm.
too. What's your shirt say?
I didn't say anything.
It says Marvel, bro.
Is that Captain Marvel?
It's Marvel of all of them. He just likes all of them. Hey, you're
Marvel's
just gonna
awesome.
have to wait like 20 minutes, okay?
Okay.
Okay.
Good to meet you.
Say bye, Ryan.
Bye.
Um, And so I was thinking about this and we were talking about it. And I remember boot camp because like I signed up to go, right? But like sleep deprivation for the first 4 days. And I remember like, how the hell am I going to do like 13 weeks of this, like 4 a.m. till 10 p.m., like probably averaging 40,000 steps a day. You're getting yelled at, you're boom. But I remember there was this one moment where I was just like, I can't leave. And I
Yeah.
just like surrendered it. And the moment I surrendered in, it got so much easier. I didn't like it anymore, but it like changed my perspective at such a drastic level because the amount of structure and things that were done. And I remember like, I was like, I can't run that fast. Like, I can't do that many pull-ups. Like, how the hell am I gonna do this? You want me to stand still for like 6 hours? You're out of your mind, right? Like, X, Y, Z. But there was this like moment because I couldn't leave. It was a federal offense. If I broke my contract, I would have gone to prison, right? Like I signed the line. So there was this moment of commitment where like there was no back door.
Mm.
And the moment, like it took like 3 weeks of being there where I'm like, wait, you really can't quit this thing. Like that dude just got arrested because he refused to train. And you're like, oh crap. You're like, what the heck did I get myself into? 8 years of this? Like, this is awesome. But then there's this moment of like surrender. And then the moment you surrender, it doesn't get any easier, but it's almost like it changed my perspective. And I was like, oh, well, I can only do my best. Like, and I'm not going to die.
Yeah.
Like, I'm not going to die. And I genuinely remember it. And now most of the time I'm like, God, I'm such a pansy compared to what I used to be. Like, holy moly, like how did I do that? But really, it's like no different. Like, I think that's why visions are so important and purpose is so important and having a why is so important because the traps that I fell into was like, it wasn't at all costs. It was only if it was convenient. I made these little back doors out of them. Right. And it's like having a purpose greater than you, or to our point earlier, accountability greater than you in every bucket, whether it's my relationships or my goals or my friendships. It's not about how big the goal is or if you get to the vision, it's that you stay committed and who you become in the process. You can adjust them, you can do it, but you got to eliminate the back doors because we have no idea what we're capable of. None.
Mm-hmm.
And all too often, we settle for the things that we believe, the stories that we tell ourselves, to take it all the way back to your mom of like, well, this story was told to me. Yeah, but the only two fears you were ever born with was loud noises and the fear of falling. Everything else was taught.
Mm.
And so if they were taught, they can be retaught and they can be reprogrammed, but it requires the first thing is us like letting go of this. This is how it is. Or God, I even remember this. I was like, I'm just big boned. I was fat.
Mm.
And I would say those things. I'm like, no, I'm not. I'm just not being honest with myself. I don't have a purpose big enough or a why deep enough that I want to actually change this yet. But it's like when you get into that and you have that why and that accountability and that purpose, it's really just about making progress towards it every day and not getting wrapped up in the identity of it. Like, not even getting wrapped in the identity, like, oh, I'm at the gym before everybody. Because if I break my leg, I might not be able to be.
Yeah.
But in that moment, I had that ability and now I can apply that somewhere else. But it's just like constantly flexing that muscle over and over and over again in conversations and honesty and integrity. Like I get sweaty in most of my conversations with my friends because I'm like, I have to say something.
Mm.
And then I'm like, oh, it hit my heart. And then they're like, God, thank you. And they do the same thing for me. And they're like, dude, I've been putting this conversation off for a week. I'm like, why, you a-hole? What if I'm
Mm.
praying for a week? And they're like, oh, right. And it's just this constant, like, just flex a little bit, like, just stretch a little bit. Cause, like, what's the worst that's going to happen? Like, for me, and even those conversations, I'm like, whoa, I way missed. I'm sorry. And they're like, yeah, but I appreciate you being honest and trying. And I'm like, okay, got it. Right. Like, what's the
Mm-hmm.
worst that's going to happen if I go do that workout or if I try to write a book or if I launch a podcast? It's better to try and know than to always wonder
Yep.
over and over and over again. And I think it's just this obsession for everybody and an invitation to recognize that the only time our story dies is when we stop writing it.
Uh,
And I think we live in a world and we live in a society that celebrates people's stories being over instead of continuing to grow and write them. And like I have a woman who comes to mind, Mama Kimball, I love her to pieces. She's 76 freaking years old and still goes to conferences and still runs them and hires coaches and is learning. She's like, all my friends my age are checking boxes. Like, who said I get to stop living at 76? Like, why can't I keep learning?
I
Why
love
can't
that.
I learn how to be a speaker? Why can't I hire a fitness trainer and get in better shape? I'm like, you can, and you are, right? But it's like just this constant growth and evolution, I think, is the invitation underneath all of it. Because truthfully, the only thing that makes my entire past make sense, my story makes sense, is utilizing it to write a sequel and then to write another one and then to write another one. And every time I rewrite it, it doesn't eliminate the dragons. It gives me new ones to face. And then I'll write another one about that, on how I overcame those ones. And I think that that's the invitation for all of us.
I want to ask you this question. I'm going to put this out here. 95% of this podcast, I went a different way. I
Totally. Totally.
went a different way. And I want to ask you this because I think about this often and it makes me wonder if you think about this. And you brought up something that was probably bypassed by most everybody, if not everybody, in our first episode about you having a chip on your shoulder attitude. At what point does that become dangerous?
Oh,
Because I think at some point, like at some point, I for a long time I had a chip on my shoulder. Like, watch me, f you, I'm gonna show you. I think that's powerful,
mm-hmm.
but I also think that's dangerous at some point. And I think about this often, as in, like, I think that chip can drive you and it could bring you places, but is it going to bring you to the place that you want to be? Is it sustainable? Do you want it to be sustainable? Do you want to possibly step on others to get to where you want to go? And like, I know you haven't, I know you've thought about this. So have
Oh
at it.
yeah, here's what I'll say. The metaphor that I would use is having a chip on your shoulder for fuel is like convincing yourself you can be an Olympian fueled by sugar. It gives you a temporary boost, but it's a guaranteed crash that will never last. And then you lose yourself in the process. Answering this now from my perspective,
Mm-hmm.
a chip on your shoulder is driven by resentment and reaction, and it's building something from the past instead of intentionally building something for the future. And it is a very limited fuel source. And when it runs out, it doesn't just run out, it runs out and your entire identity collapses because you don't know who you are without everybody else's negativity or things that you're proving or things that you're disproving. And you miss the point of the whole game.
Mm.
It's a game of one versus one. And it's not about proving yourself to anybody. It's about proving yourself to yourself. And I went through this hard. When I walked away from that first company and I'd achieved everything, I achieved it out of spite. I was like, look, I'll make it, right? I'm not going to be like my parents. I'm going to be anything. I couldn't work for like 2.5 years after because I had no energy, no drive, no desire because I had eliminated the hatred and the resentment and all of it. And I realized that I was fueled by vengeance instead of being fueled by passion and belief.
Mm.
And it took me like 2.5 years of deep, deep, deep work to find it. And this is probably the number one bucket that I coach entrepreneurs in. And it really, really hurts them at a deep, deep level. Because you also realize that if you're operating with a chip on your shoulder for a fuel source, you're limited in growth to everybody else's expectations or lack of expectations for you. And you never get to reach your full potential because no matter what, at the end of it, you always feel empty and there's always another carrot to chase, and you eventually run out of energy to chase them. I think it's deathly detrimental to operate with a chip on your shoulder,
Mm.
no matter which way you slice it. And I think it's the easiest thing to fall victim to because when you have one, it feels like you are operating on illegal drugs and can do more than the world even thinks you can. Just like that movie Limitless with Bradley
Mm-hmm.
Cooper. You're like, oh, I'll go forever. I'll prove them. I'm like, but really, you're not
Mm.
because they're sleeping and they're not thinking about you. And your father that's buried 6 feet under the ground is driving every one of your decisions right now. And he's not even here to see it. Like, who are you proving this to?
I knew you thought of this. I
Oh,
knew it.
I've thought of this deeply. I had a coach say to me, he's like, so you mean that every behavior of your day is driven by your father who will never see them and is 6 feet under the ground, who hasn't been here in over a decade? And I was like, ouch. And they're like, you want to talk about mental real estate being poached? And I was like, holy moly, right? Like there was no identity. I had no awareness of what I wanted to do or who I wanted to be. And it killed me. Like it killed my soul, like at a deep, deep level. And like I achieved everything on paper with that energy and all of it's gone. Because also when you get it and you
Mm.
realize there's no character, discipline, or understanding to maintain it. And then you end up further down the line without what you truly wanted and more time lost. And then you have to rebuild it for the right way anyways, or else you'll never keep it.
I love this. Something that I have in my phone now that it's an episode I'll record at some point, hopefully sooner than later, is an episode to my son with the things that I've learned from my podcast conversations,
Mm,
just me personally, about like, here are just quick notes about what the happiest people do. And I have, based on that question I just asked you, like working with people will get you a lot farther than working like against people. And that's something I would say in my 20s, it was more of a watch me, I don't need your help. And that got me some places.
of course.
When I flipped it and was like, hey, I can probably use your help. Can you help me? You realize how much people actually do want to help you. And what was weird was like I got this weird visual in my head. It was kind of like almost like a monkey swinging from vine. You go from one person to the next tree and to the next tree, and you're working with these people, and you're just moving along, and just everybody you meet is like helping you, and you're all helping each other. It's like a lot of that I've been thinking about recently is like there is enough happiness for everybody that you don't need to someone doesn't need to fail for you to be happy. You can both be happy. You know what I mean? Everybody, there's enough there for everybody to succeed. And I think that people feel that like I need you to fail so I can rise up. And I think there's way too much of that in the world today. That's definitely one
1000%.
thing I've learned like over the last 5 to 10 years is like people there to help you. They want to see you succeed. At least the people that like you want in your life want to see you
Mm-hmm.
succeed.
Mm-hmm.
And I've gotten so much further in my life working with people than against them.
Mm-hmm. And that's the thing. When you have a chip on your shoulder, you can't win because
Yeah.
no one else is let in. And it cuts you off from the greatest superpower in the world over and over and over again.
Yeah.
Because receiving help requires humility. And also like that's like saying like, hey, I have cancer. Screw you, oncologist. I'm gonna figure this out on my own.
Yeah.
Like that, no, I'm gonna bubble. Like you gotta really like put into perspective what you're trying to accomplish and what you're trying to achieve, right? Like we're tribal creatures and there's a lot of compression that happens when you open up and you support and you acknowledge what you want to accomplish and let people ride the ride with you. Like there's no way. Like I am not successful because of myself. I'm successful because of my network of people who love me and support me in the process. And like it's a muscle I flex every day. I was on a call yesterday with a client and we're supposed to be doing copy. And she's like, how are you? And I started crying. And she's like, how about we just make today's call about supporting you? I'm like, awesome. I bawled my eyes out for an hour. And she's like, this was the most powerful call ever. It reminded me of this, it reminded me of this. She's like, I'm here to help you. I'm your sister. Call me anytime, blank, 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 right? Like there's power in being real and asking for help. Like none of us have the answers. None of us have all of them. And even the ones that we do know, somebody knows it better than we do.
Yeah. Yep.
And I was like, so like take the shortcut. Like people want to share it, but like it's so empowering and it's so freeing and it's so like that's like the fuel source that I'm driven by. Like I know on my low days, like I can have them, but my people around me fill in the rest of the fuel in the tank. And it's okay to be that way. And I think that there's an invitation. Like I say this all the time. I was like, rising tides rise all ships, but I don't mean that lightly. Like you will never win with competition, but with collaboration, everybody wins.
Oh yeah.
Everybody wins, right? And it wins different. You look at the most successful people in the world, the best leaders in the world, they all share one trait in common. They spend all their time building up the people around them and supporting them, not building up themselves, right? Like even in the personal development world, give away what you want to get,
Yep.
right? Like easiest way to get that chip off your shoulder too is help somebody else. Like give away some of that, give some of that advice, like tell them what you're trying to accomplish, help them accomplish something. Like it changes you. Gratitude changes you. Giving changes you, right? Like it gives you the right fuel source of like impact and positivity. But like let's be honest, like you can have a chip on your shoulder all day about how much money you want to make and how big of a company you want to build. And then you're going to get in a critical car accident and the only thing you're going to crave is people to be around you. And no one's
Mm-hmm.
going to be there. Like none of this crap matters. None of it matters. And in an instant, it's all taken away. And the thing that you crave and the thing that you would desire is the thing of access to create right now.
Will you come back on a third time?
Yeah, please. Please, please, please. I'd love to.
I know you have to go see your son. I got to see my son. We didn't even talk about your legs and the surgery, and we have more gratitude and
We
thankfulness
got
to
part
talk about.
three.
Oh
We
my
got part three.
God.
We can make this, we can just make this a book. Like we can
It's,
just do it, we can just do a book. But I also like genuinely love this conversation. And so much of it is timely for like what's been showing up in my life. Like even a conversation I had earlier today was a part of this and like things I'm navigating with questions you asked me. Like it's all divinely led, right? It's all
yeah,
perfect. It's
I'm
all
dealing with it
exactly where it
too.
needs to be. And like I think that that's my favorite part. And listen, it's a podcast. That's what it's
Yeah.
supposed to be. It's supposed to be a
Yeah.
conversation, right? It's like, hey, welcome in. Like we might as well not recorded this because I would have had the same exact conversation too. So
Right.
everybody else just gets brought into the circle for this one.
But I like how they get a learning, like a learning moment from this too. Like I was asking genuine questions, and my
Hmm.
goal from this podcast is so people can actually take from this and bring this into their lives and apply it to them. I'm going to do it to mine now.
Hmm.
I was honest and vulnerable in this. Now I've learned something, and there's definitely things that I'm going to apply, whether hard or easy. Definitely hard. I'm definitely going to apply that and see how it goes for me.
Yeah, and I think too the point that I would make to end the show is that like I don't have this figured out.
Yeah,
I
no one
everything
does.
everything I said today is a dose of medicine that I'm living in. I'm just living in it at a different level than I was when I learned it, right? There's
Mm,
no finish line to this. It's like, oh, that. Oh, that can be better. That can be more in integrity. I can be deeper there. I can have this here, right? But I think it's an invitation for all of us to remember our humanity and throw the rigidity out in the trash. Like my beliefs today might be different in 6 months, right? Like I might learn something. Like I learn things when you talk to me and ask me questions and I listen. Like wow, that challenged my perspective. Let me try that one on for size. Let me see if that
mm.
aligns deeper. Let me see if that gets me better results, right? I think the biggest thing for me is like if you're listening to this, like let this be a permission slip to try something. Like try something different. Try a different perspective. Try a different action and then have the discipline and the consistency and the commitment to give it a chance to work, right? Like that's the biggest part. Like I feel like happiness is something that's only achieved when you're actively in pursuit of it. And the moment you stop pursuing it, it goes away because happiness comes on the other side of aligned intentional action. And the moment you catch it, it's no longer here. And so it's something that you will pursue forever because in every day and every moment, there's a different meaning. And I've also found that the greatest amount of happiness that I've ever had always comes through walking through adversity
Mm.
because that's where purpose comes from. Without it, we'd all be Wally, right? If everything was easy, there'd be no purpose, there'd be no meaning, there'd no be any of it. So these are just invitations for us to be in alignment. And I think that's how I define happiness. It's just genuinely you have it as long as you pursue it. And the moment you stop looking, it's gone forever.
Thank you for defining my podcast. It only took 4.5 years.
That would be you didn't ask, but that was put on my
That's
heart. And I was like, that's
amazing.
how I'm going to share it.
That's amazing. Yeah, I mean, that's honestly why I have so many different topics because it's like people find happiness in everything. People learn all these different things in different avenues. Like what touches somebody here in this episode might be something completely different in another episode. And it's like, I'm just here to help people. I'm here to help people find their happiness and, like I said, their pursuit. And I don't know if happiness is it's fleeting, right? You might feel it for a moment and it's gone. And it's like, how do I get it back? And then it's like you achieved so many times I've had people on this podcast where it's like they've achieved their goal and they're like, now what? Right. And
That's
then
it.
it's like
That's
on to
it.
something else.
That's it.
So
That's it. Because there's no happiness in goals. The only happiness is found in who you become and in pursuing those goals.
yeah.
Those are the things that stick forever, right? Like, here's the thing. We're all 6 feet under. We're all equal. Nobody cares about your bank account. Nobody cares about your cars. Nobody cares about your house. But
Very
what's
good
the one
point.
thing everybody remembers is who you were,
Yeah.
right? That's what I look at it as is like, who do I get to become?
You are the man, George. Where can people follow you and find
Oh,
you?
I appreciate you, man. Yeah, of course. Like, and for everybody who this was your second dose, I want to say I'm sorry and thank you at the same time. Like, I'm sorry you get to listen to me verbally process on like a therapy couch in my own journey, and also grateful that you spent time with us and you're here. And so, yeah, the two best places for me, number one is like if you just want to listen to more of my podcast, everything's linked at mindofgeorge.com. Super pink website. You'll see it. I love it. I own it. It's pink everywhere. Um, mindofgeorge.com. And if you want to connect personally, shoot me a question if I can support you in any way. If there's any takeaways you want to share, it's my Instagram, which is it's George Bryant, and the it's is included. It's not it's George, like it's George Bryant, which is the dumbest email address to ever have and use because you're on a support call. They're like, it's George. I'm like, no, the it's is included. Like, how do you say that nicely? Like, it's the biggest pain in my butt ever. But I figured the George Bryant was a little too conceited. So I went with it's. I'm like, it's a fact. That is me.
There you go.
Except this like 81-year-old realtor in Michigan has George Bryant. And so I couldn't get it.
Maybe 81, you probably maybe in a few years it'll free up.
He did, but he did eventually sell me the website like 4 years
Ah.
later, but I had already built Mind of George. And I'm like, well, now I can't use it, but I'll buy it anyways.
That's awesome. Well, George, I'll say Merry Christmas. Yeah. Happy Thanksgiving. Happy holidays. Merry Christmas to you and your family.
Thank you, my friend. And thanks for having me. And thanks for the deep conversation and being an example and being a leader and being vulnerable and being authentic and like being in the pursuit of this, man. Like it's
yeah,
an honor.
man. Anytime. And I'm excited for number 3. I don't know when it's
Me
going to
too.
happen,
Me
sooner
too.
than
We'll
later, but we'll
schedule it.
make it
Yeah,
happen.
we'll schedule it.
Round of applause, man. Anytime. Come back anytime.